Dr. M.G. Pat Robertson founded Regent University in 1978 and currently serves as our president and chancellor. He is founder and chairman of the Christian Broadcasting Network, founder of the American Center for Law and Justice, founder of Operation Blessing International Relief and Development Corporation, founder of the International Family Entertainment, Inc., and several other organizations and broadcast entities. Dr. Robertson is the author of 19 books, including The Greatest Virtue, Courting Disaster, The 10 Offenses, The Turning Tide, Shout It from the Housetops, his first fiction, The End of the Age, and of course, Right on the Money, Financial Advice for Tough Times. The Secret Kingdom was number 3 on Time Magazine's national nonfiction list. The New World Order was number 4 on the New York Times nonfiction list of America's best-selling books. The Secret Kingdom, answers to 100 of life's most probing questions, and the New World Order were each, in their respective year of publication, the #1 religious book in America. Dr. Robertson has received the following distinguished awards. He was inducted into the 2008 Virginia Cable Hall of Fame by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association for his pioneering work in the birth and growth of the cable industry. He was named a Distinguished Virginian in 2002, although we knew that fact much previous to that date. He was a member of the Hall of Fame of the National Religious Broadcasters. He has received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews for his efforts over the years in building bridges of understanding between Christians and Jews in the support of the State of Israel. In May of 2009, Dr. Robertson was awarded the Distinction in Ministry Award from the New York Theological Seminary and was inducted into the Hampton Roads Business Hall of Fame. Please help me welcome Dr. Pat Robertson.
Fun to be able to talk about my new book, which is called Right on the Money. I was talking to the publisher, and we had all kinds of names, and I said, you know, that's right on the money. She says, that'll be the title. I said, okay, that's so it is. But I think we need to understand we're in a terrific crisis here in America as far as the last depression, the one in the 29, 30, 31, 32 era. They liken what we've got to something like that or worse, and it's affecting everybody in this country. And what shocks me is that we have an administration that consistently makes bad decisions, and it's going to leave our country much like Argentina was a few years ago, when Argentina was one of the most prosperous nations on the face of the earth. The Argentines were like rich Texas oil people. They swaggered around Paris and places like that. And then because of gross fiscal mismanagement of their government, they went into a financial decline, and they haven't recovered from it since. So the United States is well on the way to doing that. This crisis that we had has resulted in payments of about $12.8 trillion to try to salvage the problems that have been developed. So in my book, Right on the Money, I began talking about wealth in general, and I quoted something that I find very interesting from John D. Rockefeller, who was considered at the time the wealthiest man on earth when he owned Standard Oil Company and all of its affiliates. And somebody said to him, Mr. Rockefeller, how much is enough? To which he replied, just a little bit more. And if you're involved in money, money is never enough. And so I pointed that out in this book, Right on the Money, is to begin it, to get ourselves in perspective. A man's life does not consist of the abundance of what he possesses. And there is no way that money is going to satisfy somebody. The more it is, it's just more zeros. You could add an additional zero, so what? It doesn't make you any happier. It doesn't make you any stronger. It doesn't make you live any longer. It doesn't do anything except the fact that you've got another zero in your bank balance. And so you could add a couple more zeros, and it still doesn't mean anything. And all the toys the rich have, they have $5 and $10 and $20 million houses. They have the latest in yachts. They have the latest in high-speed $40 million aircraft and all the rest of it. Still doesn't satisfy them. So I think we need to understand when we talk about money that money does not satisfy. So that's for starters. But I think we also need to understand, in terms of finance, that the average person has got to know how to manage their money. I understand that at least 50% of the marital discord in America is caused by money problems, fights over money. How do you spend money? How do you allocate money? How do you save money? What do you do with your money? Is a very major thing. So if we can get the money matter settled among households, we can cut the divorce rate down dramatically. I think that the other thing that we're facing right now is the baby boom generation is moving into retirement. Those who were kids a few years ago are now in their 60s, and those who are in their 60s regrettably haven't saved money for their retirement. They have saved on average less than $50,000, and $50,000 isn't even enough to keep you for a whole year, much less 20 or 30 years in retirement. So they're not ready to retire, and yet if they retire, they're thrust onto the mercy of the federal government, which has a program called Social Security. And Social Security, regrettably, is going bankrupt, and probably by the year 2019 or so, Medicare, as we know it, is going to be bankrupt, and within a few years after that, Social Security is going to be bankrupt. So we are relying on the federal government to pick up the tab for our retirement, yet we don't have the money in the retirement account to take care of us. So there's going to be a terrible shock. Now, most people were using a technique, if I can use that term, of saving money under what was called a 401k. If it's nonprofit, it's a 403 or 403b program, where they set aside a certain small amount from their paycheck each pay period, and their employer, normally speaking, matches that amount by a small amount. And over the years, that begins to grow. And it became the principal savings vehicle of all these baby boomers. Well, came the recent recession, and they have found that their 401s and 403s and others saving vehicles had lost about 50% of their value when the market went down. And so people were faced with devastating losses, and the fear that was gripping America was just palpable. People were not only losing their retirement savings, they were also beginning to lose their jobs. We've laid off 7 or 8 million people here in the United States, and it's hurting all over the board. So what do we do with all that, and how do we regulate our finances so that we don't get caught in the vice that may be coming down the road? So that's what this book is, Right on the Money. First of all, how did we get this way? It's the strangest thing that happened. The government was encouraging home ownership. That was the American way to own a house, to have your piece of the pie. And the thought was that real estate always went up. That if you owned a house, that it would go up at 2, 3, 4% a year, year after year after year after year. So it was looked at as an investment. So I'm going to invest in a house. So people bought houses. And then certain of those in Congress, not the least of which is Barney Frank, who is head of a prestigious committee of the House of Representatives right now, encouraged the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to make loans to poor people so that they could have a piece of the pie. They could have a part of the American dream. They could own their own home. So with this encouragement from Washington and from the administration as well, people began to apply for loans. Now remember that these houses that maybe sold for $200,000 are now worth $400,000, and some that sold for $400,000 are now worth $800,000. And so the bankers could figure that's a pretty good investment. I can make a loan on it, and it's going up in value. Now, loans were marketed by mortgage companies who had an incentive to place loans. They got paid a commission on the basis of the loans that they put out. So the more loans they had in the market, the more money they made. Now, the smart money guys decided that they could enhance that prospect dramatically if they could securitize those loans. So the mortgage companies began making loans to people who really shouldn't own houses to begin with. And then they passed those loans up to Wall Street, where they were bundled together and called collateralized debt obligations. And once that was done, the rating agencies came in and they said, look, these are loans from thousands and thousands of people, so they must be good. So they gave them AAA rating, which is the same rating as government bonds. And that type of rating meant they were good for investment accounts, for institutions, for schools, for municipalities, for whoever would invest in money. These loans were sliced up into these collateralized debt obligations, and then the guys in Wall Street were selling them overseas. And so all over the world, this wasn't a predominantly American phenomenon, it was a worldwide thing because we were sending these loans overseas. Now everything was just grand for a time, and these investment banking houses began to lever up as much as 40 times leverage over their initial capital. Instead of 1-to-1 or 2 or 3-to-1, which is more traditional, they had 40-to-1 leverage, which meant they were lending a huge amount of money and passing it out the door and unloading these loans, these collateralized debt obligations, on other people. Now, a sidebar of all this, the people who were picking up these pieces of paper said, well, we'd like some assurance that they won't default on us. So they went to the big insurance companies like AIG and said, can you write a policy that these loans won't go bad? And so AIG said, sure we will, at a nice fee. And they began to sell what was called collateralized debt obligations. And before long, they began to sell these things willy-nilly to anybody. And what you could do, for example, is in one block, a person could say, well, I want a insurance policy that I won't default on my loan. That's what my bank has. But what if your neighbor and the neighbor's neighbor and everybody in your block decided that they wanted to get insurance on your house and on your mortgage? And so the insurance company began to write many, many, many policies that had no relationship to the actual underlying security and the underlying property. And so they flooded the markets with these things until there was somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 trillion worth of credit default swaps. That's a lot of money. Now, you've got people, day laborers, who had no business buying $500,000 houses or $400,000, couldn't possibly afford to make their mortgage payments. And they were sold adjustable rate mortgages, so-called ARMs, and very low rates, so they could go in and pay a few $100s a month on their mortgage on this house. Well, these were reset arms, so after 3 or 4 years, they began to reset. And the true value of what these loans were worth began to come due, and this day laborer who was making maybe $400 or $500 a month suddenly had to pay several $1,000s a month on his mortgage. Well, of course, he couldn't pay it, and so he defaulted. And the banks said, well, we will foreclose on that loan. And in certain jurisdictions, all that was necessary was for the homeowner to drop off the keys. So he would say, I'm sorry, I can't make my payments. Here is the house. And he dropped off the keys. And before long, whole neighborhoods in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Miami and places like that, where there'd been such a property boom, were flooded with foreclosed properties. Now, these properties were backing up the paper that had been sold by investment banking houses all over the world. And they were held in banks as their own core capital. But as people began to look at them, they said, well, we don't know what these papers are worth. They seem to be worthless. We're not sure. I mean, is this house worth $20,000? Is it worth $50? Is it worth $100? We don't know what it's worth because it's in default and we can't assess a value to it. The banks, therefore, were unable to get additional capital because they didn't have enough money to back up another loan from another bank, so nobody would loan to them. And the credit markets, they used the term seized up. So nobody could get a loan. And because businesses couldn't renew their lines of credit and others couldn't get money to buy houses, startup businesses couldn't get financed for startups, the whole economy froze up. And things began to go into default. There were tremendous loans, and companies that had gone way out on a limb on these collateralized debt obligations and these fancier instruments, they went under. Lehman Brothers, which is one of the most oldest and venerable investment banking houses in the world, declared bankruptcy. And others became wards of the state. And the look was at AIG. They were so afraid of these credit default swaps because not only was there $50 trillion out in credit default swaps, there were also so-called derivatives. And a derivative is a bet. It's a bet. You can bet if you want to that a fly will crawl up a window pane or it'll go down a window pane. And that's a derivative. You know, it's the fly derivative. You know, you can bet that oil prices will go up or go down. Gold will go up or go down. Tin will go up or go down. Wheat will go up or go down. You can write contracts on anything, and then you can get more complex contracts where you look at the ratio of a basket of currencies to another basket of currencies, and you bet on that ratio. So it gets increasingly complex to such a degree that the former head of the Fed said, I don't understand the things, and nobody else did either. But about a year ago when I wrote this book, $700 trillion in derivatives in the world. Now it's over, a quadrillion? It's over $1 quadrillion derivatives. And this is why the powers that be in the Treasury are so totally spooked about what could happen in our economy. Because if counterparties begin to refuse to honor their bets, then it could unravel the whole financial system of the world and bring on one of the worst crashes that we have ever conceived of. That is the sword of Damocles hanging over the head of the economy of the United States and of the world. Now, the big boys don't like to talk about that, but that's the danger out there. If we have derivatives in excess of $1 quadrillion, they say, well, that's the nominal value of them, but of the notational value. But nevertheless, that is the situation we're faced with. That's why they have gone to such heroic efforts. We've just seen the last couple of days, Lewis, the head of the Bank of America, has been grilled because he says that the head of the Federal Reserve Board and the head of the Treasury essentially twisted his arm and said, you will buy Merrill Lynch, whether you want it or not, you will buy it. You will rescue Merrill Lynch, regardless of how many billions of dollars they owe, because if it goes down like Lehman Brothers, the whole house of cards might collapse. So anyhow, that's the backdrop that we're dealing with now, and that problem has not been solved. The Obama administration is throwing billions, trillions of dollars at it, but unfortunately the first rescue package was a payoff to Democratic constituencies. And some of the money that has been spent has been nothing short of ludicrous, absolutely ludicrous. So they're loading the United States taxpayer with this huge debt burden. And if they continue, the amount of debt taxes going to have to be spent by the American taxpayer will go up to about 60%. It's really horrible to contemplate how deep in the hole we're going and how much money is being spent. Now, of course, they can say we're going to take on health care. In addition to that, it will be between $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion to assume health care. And that meant that the United States government is going to crowd out the private insurance companies, and they will then be responsible for all the health care of everybody in this nation. And it's going to be a hideous mess. So this is the book Right on the Money. That's the backdrop in which we have to operate. But people still need to do appropriate planning. The first item that I point out in this book has to do with something that's fairly simple, but it's not being practiced by many people. They have to have a budget. A budget is nothing more or less than figuring what kind of money comes in, what kind of money goes out. And there are two types of budget. One is the fixed, that is, has to do with money that will have to be paid regardless. And then there's the discretionary, which is money that can be optional. Every family needs a budget, and every family needs to determine what are our fixed costs. If we have a mortgage, what is the mortgage payment? If we have taxes, what are the taxes? If we have certain other things that are definite costs, then that's how much is our fixed income. Then the balance is into discretionary. So we then can write down, here's what we'd like to do. And here's where families can make a huge amount of mistakes, because they can feel like, well, I feel flush today, so let's go out and eat a $100 dinner, when they can't pay their grocery bill. But here again, we've got in this book, Right on the Money, ways that families can cut their spending, get the thing back in line so that they can live more comfortably. But if they get in $40,000 a year and they spend $45,000 a year, they will be in debtor's hell. And where do? They go to the credit cards and they run up credit card balances, which now are 18%. And if a person misses a couple of payments, they ratchet up to 27, 28% interest, and the person can't ever get out. And the one thing that nobody should do is to take that minimum monthly payment. That if on a $3,000 or $4,000 loan, you could spend 20 or 30 years paying off the balance, because they rigged it so that you can't get out. And this is the kind of thing that I warn people about in this book. The other thing that I recommend is that you only have 2 credit cards. That means plastic surgery on the rest of them. One that you use primarily for the various expenses. The other one is standby in case there's an emergency, and maybe you have to buy one thing on it once a year just to keep it active, but no more. 1, 2, nothing else besides that. The other thing that is so important is that every family have a minimal cash balance of probably 5 or 6 months of expenses so that they won't just completely be at the mercy of the events that may take them over a period of time, and they can have some feeling of security in terms of their money. So these are a couple of simple things. I have many things in this book that you'll find interesting. I've got one chapter in here about how to start a business. I am a great believer in entrepreneurship. I think that people, if at all possible, should enjoy the fruits of the free enterprise system and should get into business. It's not all that hard. I indicated that a lady with a third-grade education could make a beautiful entrepreneur, no problem. If they can add, subtract, and divide, that's all they need to know. Here's what I'm going to get from my products. Here's what I'm going to spend on my products. Here are the other expenses. I add them up. And if there's a balance, then I've got a profit. That's business. I know we like to make it a lot tougher because we have masters and doctors in business, but that essentially is what it amounts to. I also point out in Right on the Money something about families. More and more women are in the workplace. More and more women are getting paid very nice salaries. More and more women are getting paid more money than their spouses. That sets up a conflict because the spouse wants to tell the woman, the wife, how to spend her money. And the woman doesn't want to do it that way. It's my money, I earned it, I'm going to spend it the way I want to. So a couple has got to make a decision as to what they're going to do with their money. And it needs to be, very dispassionate. And yet, here's what I recommend. And it's all in this book, Right on the Money. I think that the couple should determine what are their expenses, and then which expenses are going to be the obligation of the wife, which expenses are going to be the obligation of the husband. And that means that, let's say that there's rent or there is a mortgage payment, and the husband says, all right, that's mine, I'll take that. There's a car payment, and the husband says, I'll take that. And then there are expenses for groceries, children's clothes, and so forth. And the wife says, all right, I'll take that. I'll run the household expenses. And then what about insurance? Somebody's got to pay for the insurance. Somebody's got to pay for health insurance and all the rest of it. And they can work it out very rationally. But I do think that if a wife brings home money, she should have her own bank account and her own brokerage account. And so she can make investment decisions with her money. I think it's the same thing with the husband. It's his money, so he puts it in the account. And hopefully they can get together and agree on what to do, especially in relation to charitable contributions, because I think the charitable contribution should be put down as one of the fixed expenses. I think the most important thing in money is to have God on your side. And I recommend here 2 keys to financial prosperity. One is to give. The Bible says, give and it'll be given unto you, pressed down, good measure, running over, will men heap into your bosom. And I think every couple should have money set aside for charitable giving. The tithe was the amount that was in the Old Testament, New Testament, and I think that should be a foundation of somebody's giving. It shouldn't be accidentally, if there's something left over, it should be one of the fixed expenses that somebody has. Our contributions to charity should come at the top of the list. The second thing that I think is important is to understand the principle of the law of use. Lord Rothschild called this the 8th wonder of the world. Alfred Einstein spoke of it as being one of the immutable laws of physics that was as powerful as any that he knew of. And that is that money will multiply according to the interest rate being charged. I like what I call the rule of 72, that if you will take the amount of compound interest that your investments will garner and you divide that into 72, you will learn how many years it takes you to have your money doubled. And if it doubles for, say, 4 years, it goes to 8, then it goes, another 12, and it doubles every period of time that goes through. So when a person gets to a certain age, before long, they will have much more money than they realize possible. And that, to me, is the way to become a millionaire. It isn't to hit the lottery. It's not to hit a jackpot. It's not to take radical moves in the stock market. Now, in addition to all these things, there needs to be an investment portfolio as people gain a little bit of money. And where do they put their money? How is it allocated? Well, I go into some detail in this book about the appropriate balancing of somebody's money. And the other thing is that once you've determined so much goes to bonds, so much goes to equity, so much goes to foreign, so much goes to large cap, small cap, and all those other things that involved in an investment portfolio. If one class exceeds the others dramatically, then the important thing is to sell off a part of that and reinvest to get back to the balance. That's what's known as balancing the portfolio. And people need to understand how to balance their money. I'm talking in here about fixed income, about how it works, how coupons work, how these various investment vehicles work, what happens in the stock market, where it is now and where it's going, and that's all here. In addition, I think we need to understand about mutual funds, things like insurance policies, what's smart insurance, what isn't smart insurance, what is foolish insurance, what is good insurance. I think something called whole life is stupid, yet there are many people who make a good living selling it. I think that the important thing, in my opinion, is to get term insurance on the amount of money you want in case you die, and also to recognize that when you get to a certain age and your children get to a certain age, you probably don't need insurance anymore. And so it'd be better to reinvest that money into something that will grow, like mutual funds or like stocks and bonds. But the other is to keep a certain term policy in effect and then use the balance of what you would have for insurance to put into stocks and bonds. I think there's such things as annuities. Annuities work well in relation to certain classes of people in certain financial areas. But generally speaking, an annuity ties up your money. You can't get it if you need it. And they have a big load going in on most annuities to pay for the salesman. And so you're paying for their work in selling you the policy. And it's difficult to know what to do. The other thing that people are facing right now is a mortgage. When do you buy and when you don't buy? I've got a chapter in this book called Love Nest or Money Pit. And you can determine how it stacks up. People are always asking me, is it time to buy? Is it time to buy? Is it time to buy a house? Well, sometimes it is and sometimes it's not. It depends on the house. It depends on your circumstances. It depends on what kind of a deal is out there and what kind of financing is available. The other thing that people are asking right now is it time to finance? Well, there are rules I've got in this book, Right on the Money, is the formula of when it's appropriate to refi and when it's appropriate to hold what you've got. I think people keep asking me these questions, on television. I keep saying, do the math. Do the math. Sit down and work out the equation. If I'm going to live in this house for 5 more years, and if it costs me so much money to refinance it, and if I have a savings and interest of so much, what will be left? And many times the answer is nothing. It'll cost more money. The other, it'll be a lot of money left, and it'll be a good deal. So a person has to determine what their own situation is in regard to real estate. I strongly recommended against buying real estate about 3 or 4 years ago. I knew it was overpriced, overvalued, and lo and behold, the prices of houses have dropped 40, 50%. So people who jumped in 4 or 5 years ago and said, oh boy, this is a great investment, have essentially lost half of their money. Furthermore, they can't get out. They want to sell these things and they got nobody who will buy them. And that's a very unpleasant feeling. But this is why one must be cautious in terms of real estate. But again, in terms of refinancing real estate, we have a fellow over at CBN who's on our crew, and he said, I've just lowered my monthly expenses by $800. He refinanced his mortgage, and he got an extraordinarily good rate and a nice package that worked well for him and his finances. He's not going anywhere for the rest of his life, so he's not going to sell the house. And for him, it's wonderful. He refinanced. Somebody's going to move in a month or a year or 2 years. It might not be a good deal. So it just depends. And all this is here in this book, Right on the Money. And some of the chapters I would like to read to you just to show you what's here. The first one says, why aren't I rich? And the second one says, why do I run out of money? The third one is, where do I get credit where credit is due? The next one, how do I dig myself out of debt? The next one, what's my score? It talks about credit scores and how you compute them. What is my roadmap to wealth? What is my engine to wealth? What if I don't like risks? Are mutual funds and exchange traded funds for me? What about options, gold, and futures? Will I be a homeowner? Should I prepay my mortgage? Should I refi my mortgage? How do I work to prepare for winter? What can make old age more secure for me? And how do I bring all the pieces together, and so forth and so on? And how do I pay for care in my old age? I've got something in here having to do with insurance, and one of the best insurance policies I think is extremely important is catastrophic care on the one hand, but for somebody that's concerned about long-term care, I think they're relatively cheap policies, and long-term care is very important for somebody as you move along. All of a sudden you're put in a nursing home, and who's going to pay for it? So if you have a policy that's not too expensive for something like that. But there are many other tips in here about how you balance your investments, and balance your real estate, you balance your retirement. It's all here. So I'm going to turn this little gathering over to Dr. Campo if you have some questions.
Great. Let's thank the doctor. I know for me, I'm already thinking about plastic surgery in new ways, so...
I'll lend you the scissors.
We do want to make sure you raise your hand so we can recognize you, and we do invite you to ask some questions now for Dr. Robertson. We have one right up front here. Yes, please.
Dr. Robertson, in previous periods of our nation's economy, increases in the federal debt have increased inflationary conditions. So from your experience, what financial principles from your book strengthen a family's financial position so they can plan to pay for their children's college and also give more to church ministries?
When the government begins to print more money, which it's doing right now, do you all understand what happens? I mean, it's not rocket science, but when the government needs more money, the Federal Reserve prints it, just prints it. You know, it used to be, you look at a dollar. I don't know if I got a dollar. Here's a dollar. Here's a dollar. If you got one in your pocket, read what it says at the top of it. You see that? I'll give it to Dr. Campo here. You see what that says?
You're really testing me now. Federal Reserve note?
That's right. Now, if you don't like this and you want to turn it back into the government for something, what are they going to give you in its place?
I'm sure it won't be gold or silver.
It'll be another one of these. It may have a little bit different
Serial number.
But it used to be you could get gold. It was called a gold certificate or certificate. You don't get any of that anymore. It's strictly a promise. It's an IOU in the federal government. So with that in mind, they can print all those they want to. So they run the printing presses, and then the Treasury wants money, so the Treasury whips up a bunch of Treasury bills and notes and long-term, short-term, so forth, and they sell them to the Fed. And the Fed gives them cash, and they take that cash and they pay the bills of the government. That's how it works. And if they need more cash, they print more. That's a good deal. I mean, wouldn't you like to have your own printing press in the backyard? Just crank them out. Well, that's fine as long as they can keep that under control. I think it's already gotten out of control, and so does the rest of the country. I noticed the so-called BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, had begun to say we've got to have a different reserve currency. The dollar has been the reserve currency of the world. Now, what does this mean? It means the more of those things you print, the price of oil is going up, the price of gold is going up, price of nickel, of copper, of iron, of lumber, you name it. It's all gone up. It's going up because there's so many dollars chasing these items. So you want to build a house, it's going to, right now it's cheap, but it's going to go way up. And your groceries are going to go up. A dozen eggs will cost you more, a loaf of bread will cost you more, and all the way up and down the line. So the question is, how do I protect myself? Well, maybe you can go to Vanuatu or someplace. That's one thought, the Channel Islands. But in all seriousness, as far as an investment strategy, I think investing in hard assets such as gold and silver and crude oil and commodities and that kind of thing, I think that's where it's going to be. And in terms of currency, at least up to recently, these things have gotten a little too high now, but I recommend it for CBN. We've got some money that's into currencies, and we've picked up about $1 million or so going from United States currency into Australian dollars and into Canadian dollars because their economy is based on natural resources. So how does the average person protect themselves? I really don't know. Look what happened in Germany back in the 20s. Things just went crazy, and then before long they got to be hyperinflation. I was in Zaire talking to the cabinet, and I told them what was going to happen if they kept printing money, and I said, you know, your economy is going to be destroyed and people are going to be rioting in the streets. Well, they had a currency called the Zaire that was about 3 or 4 to 1 to the United States dollar. Within a short period of time, it went to 40,000 to 1. And everybody lost their money. Their money was worthless. It was absolutely worthless. And so that means that your savings in dollars are worthless. And the dollar, I can't see the dollar being anything except weak. And so how do you protect yourself? Well, you figure that's the scenario. How do you get out of dollars? But I like commodities and things like that. Somebody else.
Great. Other question?
There.
Yes.
Young lady here. Gentleman back there. Yeah. Go ahead. Both of you. All right. You're next.
Dr. Robertson, one thing I very much appreciate about you is that you can make the relatively complex very easy to understand. So thank you for doing that. That's what I'd like you to address. Two things, both kind of dealing with China. First of all, what is the significance of the Chinese having so much of our debt? In other words, what happens if they say, we're no longer going to buy your debt anymore? How would that affect it other than increasing the rate? In addition, secondly, again, primarily dealing with China, what is the significance of trade balances or imbalances that we've had for so long? What will be the effect of that over the long term?
Well, you know, the Bible says the borrower is the servant of the lender. The Chinese hold somewhere around $1.2 trillion of our money. That's the kind of debt obligation we have to the Chinese, which means if we ever started getting hard-nosed with China, they would just say, okay, we'll take you down. And they start flooding the market with dollars, and the dollar drops dramatically, and the prices of everything we buy in this country would shoot up dramatically. And our people would be screaming because the average steel worker and automobile worker and what have you would be desperate for money. Now, that's what all that means. The Chinese aren't going to do that because they enjoy trade with us, and they've got to find some market to sell their goods. They're cranking all this stuff out at this cheap labor. So they have to have somebody to buy it, and we're it. But the trade balance, at least in the classical thought, was that if I had sales of $100 and I have purchases of $90 and I've got a trade balance of $10, which normally speaking, I would go and then trade with somebody else, and the flow would continue to go. As things are now, the Chinese have added so much, and the United States has been so profligate, it's no longer a decent balance. Usually your currency would go down, and so you'd sell more goods, and then it would go up, and you'd sell less goods. It would be an equilibrium. That's classical economics. But nothing is classical any longer with us breaking all the rules. So what does the trade balance mean? It means that sooner or later those debts are going to come due, and they're going to either demand payment or they're going to start dumping our money. And either way, it'd be very painful. Now the young lady. Yes, ma'am. You're on.
Dr. Robertson, what I've heard you talking about today is basically what the Bible says, which is people perish for lack of knowledge. And, you were just saying about the average person has got to know how to manage their money better. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are. Would you support, I know some universities have started requiring financial management education for incoming freshmen. Would you support that at even the high school level, or definitely more within colleges? Do you think that would help the problems that we're having?
Well, I think it would, because right now the American people are deeply in debt. We have a savings rate that's close to zero. When we went into the last depression, we had large savings among the citizens, and so we were able to weather the storm. But right now, our savings rate, as I say, is close to zero. We're not saving any money. And we're spending everything we've got. And we've got leaders such as the late, great George Bush, who said, go spend your money. Well, that isn't exactly fiscal restraint. But I think, of course, the average person in school can't balance a checkbook. How many of y'all, can you balance your checkbook? Okay. Well, so many in college can't, and they just spend, and they think that these plastic cards are just sort of their privilege, and they don't have to worry about it. Just give them the piece of plastic, and everything's fine. And they think a 10% monthly payment is a good deal, and they just don't think about money. And we don't want to be absorbed with money. Let's face it. Our life does not consist of the abundance of things we possess, but good stewardship is very, very important. So if we had courses in that, it would be very helpful. Well, listen, I appreciate everybody being here. You're very gracious, and I would be remiss if I didn't remind you to go buy the book. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.